Hello, my name is Piotr Tomiak and I'm maintainer of WebStorm Vue.js plugin. Today I want to talk to you about web types. It's an open source standard for documenting Vue.js libraries developed by JetBrains, and it allows to provide library documentation in a single JSON file, for which schema is available at Schema Store and directly through GitHub repository. You may wonder, what does it have to do with quick documentation, and what do I mean by quick documentation? So let me give you an example. I have a TypeScript file here and I'm coding and I want to invoke a function from path module. So by invoking code completion on the path module variable, I'm accessing documentation. I can see what functions are available here. I don't have to go to Node.js documentation portal to see what kind of functions are there. And for each function, I also get detailed documentation. And the same happens for my own interfaces. I also get list of available properties. So that's what I mean by quick documentation, that you really get documentation quickly within the IDE. Let's see how it works with Vue.js. So I have a project with Bootstrap library installed here, and I'm using VS Code for that. So I get a list of components and some documentation for them, which is great. And for each component, I'll get some attributes and associate documentation as well. What I would miss here is probably a link to documentation on the web to see more examples. And default values. But overall, it's pretty cool, right? Now, the trouble starts when I want to go to the source of the component to see how it works. That's not possible. And when I'm starting to use directives. So I only get a list of default core Vue.js directives. But I won't get code completion for instance, tooltip directive from Bootstrap Vue. So this is where web types will help us. But before we go into that, I would like to show you a little bit on how coding environments are working and how they help you to code faster. There are several major areas of interest, so to speak, starting with a simple ones like syntax highlighting and ending up with refactorings. For the first two, we don't really need to understand the source code well. We can even deal with regular expressions when we do syntax highlighting. But for things like code completion, we need to understand what kind of type the variable is, or whether a particular mixin was registered with Vue. So this is where IDE has to analyze the source code. And in case of Vue, and especially Vue templates, it's pretty difficult because there are so many places and so many ways a components, plugins, directives, filters can be registered directly on Vue instance through mixins, that it's pretty difficult to kind of analyze the whole source code, but it's of course doable. Vue 3 is making things simpler here for IDEs as well, but yeah, you still have to support Vue 2 syntax as well. So how it works that we can provide a very quickly list of filters when you invoke code completion in Vue.js expression. And the filters are, for instance, defined in recursive mixin or in global Vue mixin. So WebStorm, when you start it first on a project, it indexes all the source code files. It's taking some time. You can see that progress on the bottom of the screen. And what happens during that time is that we parse all the relevant files and create stubs from them, which are kind of a smaller versions of the files with only relevant information. And then we store the results in different indexes. For instance, an index of view filters, so that when we want to provide code completion for filters, we know which files to look filters in. While choosing files which we want to parse, we try to skip irrelevant library files. So for instance, if the library has TypeScript typings, we don't parse JavaScript files because that wouldn't make sense. And the core of the operation is to convert a source code into a smaller file which contains so-called stubs. That file is binary, and it's much smaller in size, and we can easily refer to that from indices. So why analyzing of libraries is so hard, right? We can very nicely analyze the source code of the project. Why not do the same with libraries? First of all, libraries are compiled. You will get a code which is smaller in size. Some of the libraries, of course, ship the source code with the Node module, but it varies from library to library. It's difficult because each library, for instance, initializes components in a different way. So that approach was not good enough, and we had to figure out something else. A next idea, right, is to just run the library and see what happens in the runtime. And that's pretty cool because you have a good list of components available. However, you don't really get information on things which are available dynamically. So for instance, slots, events from the component, you don't get list of directive modifiers. So there is a lot of information which we're still missing. Well, another idea was to kind of combine those two together, but it also failed because we still are lacking good documentation on components and directives. So we had to look somewhere else. And the kind of a obvious choice to look for was TypeScript definition files, right? They are pretty cool. They are really cool from IDE perspective. A single file specifies, or multiple files, but basically a single format specifies a library contract. It's kind of a black box. You don't really need to read the source code to know what things are available on the variables, on interfaces, etc. And even if library is not providing DTS files with it, you can still get them from @types namespace, where everyone can contribute type definitions for a particular library. So we really wanted to find something like that for Vue.js templates, right? It would be pretty cool. So first of all, we looked at existing solutions, and we looked at especially at Vtur. And as you could see, well, it has some limitations because you can only provide description for a list of tags or a list of attributes, which is in a separate file. Well, there is no place for directives, modifiers, documentation links, filters, and things like that. So we had to look somewhere else. And it turns out that quite a few libraries are actually developed their own standard, like a middle standard for between source code and documentation tooling. And for instance, Quasar is generating JSON files, which they then are consumed by their documentation tooling. And it was really interesting idea. And we also found a Vue types, which was a community proposition for the standard. But each of those things were not enough. They were not generic enough for us. And Well, when we were developing web types, there was no Vue 3 yet. So I've recently looked at Vue 3 standard, and well, Vue 3 is really awesome when it comes to providing good code completion for components when you're coding the components. But for libraries, especially if you have to do it by hand, because not all of the Vue libraries are going and are being coded in TypeScript, it's not, I would say, it's not comfortable. And it's also missing several things like slots or modifiers for directives. So I would say that Vue 3 has a potential to be an ultimate documentation for the library, also to provide the documentation for the library, but it would require a lot of work on how the types are structured. And I believe that's not a goal for Vue 3 at this point. So we had to figure out something new, a new standard, and well, of course, right? So we set some goals for it because we wanted it to be open source so that everyone can actually use it, can contribute, and the whole community can benefit from it. We didn't want to limit it to IDEs. That's our primary goal, to use it for our IDE. But we wanted to have something which will be generic, which can be used by linters, by documentation generators, and other things, I don't know. And we wanted it to be universal. So like TypeScript definition files are actually universal, because whether you code in TypeScript or JavaScript or CoffeeScript, you can actually provide a TypeScript definition file for the library, and it will really nicely describe the contract of the library. So we wanted to have something which will be suitable for Vue, but also for web components, also for a simple HTML libraries, which are providing just tag icons, tags which contribute icons, right? Or just some CSS styles. And of course, it has to be easy to create and consume, so all of these different toolings can actually make use of it. So yeah, well, JSON is a very simple and standard to consume, file format to consume, and that's what we chose for web types. We're also providing a web types namespace, so that if library is not shipping web types with it, like for instance Vue core or Vue router, you can still get web types for it. And the standard is actually applicable to local projects and private libraries and public libraries. You can you just have to add web types property to package JSON, and the IDE will be available to provide all the documentation for the library. The schema is available on Schema Store, and recently we've added support for automatic generation of web types using Vue DocGen API package. However, as the package itself, it only can provide documentation for components, so you still have to inject documentation for directives. But since it's a JSON file, it's relatively easy to add that during the build process. Currently, web types are being used are being bundled by Bootstrap Vue, Quasar, Vuetify, Nuxt.js. And they are available through web types, as I mentioned before, for Vue router and some other smaller libraries. And various developers are using web types for their own internal libraries, so that their teams can easily use internal libraries without going to documentation portals or browsing through source code. Let me show you now how it looks with the same Vue.js file I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So when you use Bootstrap Vue with WebStorm, you will get a similar code completion on for the tag, a documentation for it, but you'll also get a link to external documentation. You'll get default values for attributes, and you'll also get ability to navigate to the source code or TypeScript definition file, as in this context. It all depends on the library provider, what would she set as a source for the component. But where it gets really interesting is that you can actually provide documentation for directives, such as a Bootstrap tooltip directive. And you can document argument. You can also document directive modifiers together with a pattern, which can later on be verified with IDE whether it matches or not the pattern. So I think the web types are providing ability to actually get quick documentation for your Vue.js templates without having to go to external documentation on web for a particular framework. And even if you have to go, you still have a link. So I believe it saves a lot of time. Besides the things I have shown you, the web types can also provide information about component slots, component events, and information about available filters. You can provide documentation in HTML, Markdown, or plaintext, and you can provide source navigation, and supported type syntax right now is only TypeScript. But the standard itself is created in a way where it's extensible, and in the future we can provide also other types syntax. We plan to provide support for Vue mixins, which is kind of connected with providing documentation inheritance. Because, for instance, if you have elements which provide icons, and you can get like 200 such elements, they all share a lot of common documentation with each other. So that would save a lot of space and make the JSON file much smaller. We also plan to support CSS. We plan to support regular HTML attributes for simpler libraries, which do not necessarily use Vue.js as a framework, and support web components. And that's where you can get involved. You can contribute web types to your favorite library to make everyone's life easier. By contributing to web types namespace, or contributing a PR to bundle web types with a library during the build process of the library. You can also add support for web types for your favorite editor, be that VS Code, Atom, or Vim. And you can also add support to documentation generator. We're always welcoming PRs to improve the web type schema. All documentation and everything is available in web types repository. And thank you very much for your attention. And now it's question and answers time.